Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast.
Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Stephen Rose. Coach Rose is the founder of Waffle Iron Gym, a grassroots training community that began in his home garage in 2017 and grew into a local hub for strength, power, and speed development. A graduate of Southern Connecticut State University with a bachelor's in business administration and accounting, Stephen has competed across multiple strength sports, including powerlifting, strongman, Olympic weightlifting, and the Highland Games. Driven by a passion for performance and community, he's built a training crew where neighbors and friends push each other to get stronger every day. Rose's approach blends old school grit with smart evidence-based programming, creating an environment where anyone willing to work can thrive. So on the show, Coach.
Thanks for having me. It's been exciting getting asked to come on here after listening to all the ones that I've listened to.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know how exciting it could possibly be, but hey, I'll take it. We got to be friends. I don't know. It's been a couple years ago on Instagram, and we would chat back and forth. And it was after, I don't know if it was a Brandon Bird podcast or something like that. Somebody we both follow, but it's been a unique conversation over the last couple of years.
Oh, definitely. And I think both of us kind of evolved where it's you kind of get stuck in your own rut, and then it's like, all right, where's the opposite, and where do we go from here? And then as we were talking about before we started recording, like with Michael Fahey, when he says, if it's true all the time. And it's like, okay, how does that apply to everything? And that's kind of how I think you and I both go down all of these different rabbit holes where we'll be talking about Woodrow Wilson or FDR and all these weird things. And it's like, oh, wait, he knows about that too.
My nerdiness knows no bounds, I can assure you. And if there's a conspiracy theory buried in it somewhere, I've looked into it.
Well, you know what, though? I feel like, so with my whole backstory of like, I always looked at when Khalil Sherrod had his conjugate seminar in Atlanta, Georgia in 2020. I realized that my only claim to fame was coming back from my snowmobile injury. And it was like, all of these people like Jacob Ross and Nate Harvey and Michael Fahey and all these people are there. And I'm just this weird guy from Connecticut that's training his neighbors. I'm like, why is Michael Fahey talking to me?
It's a community where everybody wants to talk to people. I mean, you'll get some guys that'll big time you, I'm sure. I haven't ran into a ton of those, but everybody wants to hear how the system's working and how it's working for you and where are you making your impact. You're very much like me. You're very community based. You're not looking to make a ton of money at this. You just want to be involved, have a little fun, and stay in shape.
Yeah, and I think that was the big thing so I've got 3 kids that are all 21 that are lifting with me. And I joke because I'm just like, I get charged in gains. That's, I don't charge anything. It was my neighbors, and then one of the kids, my neighbor had moved to the other side of town, and so we were tracking 40-yard dashes, and he was running like a 5.8, and I was running like a 5.3, and it made no sense that I was beating him. And so I'm heckling him a little bit, and there's this other kid that was watching and like really curious because in Somers, Connecticut, nobody has lasers to track a 40, and I was like, hey, do you want to run 40s with us? And the kid thinks that I'm nuts, and he runs like a 5.8. And then that's how it kind of like folded into, well, he and his dad started coming over, and then he started training consistently. And then he brought a friend's brother, and the little brother started getting stronger than his older brother that was friends with the first kid. And that's how it snowballed into, okay, this is our new crew. And so it's just one of those where it's like, it's all word of mouth. And we joke, like I have written in chalk on one of the squat racks. It's a fictitious training center because it doesn't really exist. There's no money. There's no, I want to emphasize that for the IRS that, there is no business here at all. It's just voluntary association.
And that's the problem, right? It's voluntary association with no money coming in, but through all that, I have a bunch of money going out.
Oh yeah. Well, and that I don't want to go into too much of that, but my day job is as an auditor. So I work for the government, and as an auditor, I make decent money. And my wife's also an accountant, so we live within our means. We do well enough that I figured with my hobby, I'm better off buying gym equipment than I am buying booze or drugs. And if I have it, why not share it with everyone around me?
That's how I've fallen into this. I've been an electrician the majority of my life. I cowboyed on the side. We left for a while. We went and cowboyed on some ranches. That's kind of how that timeline goes. And that was my overall pursuit. That's where I wanted to be. But then, the reality of a family and kids and, cowboying's pretty hard to make some money
Oh yeah.
unless you're way up the ladder. But come back home. Now we work at a powerhouse, and kind of like you, it's a very good job. And they, it affords me the ability to do what we do.
Yep.
And without it, we wouldn't be able to. But it's something that I'm at home
Oh
every night. Like you said, we could be out chasing a whole bunch of different things, but everybody knows where I'm going to be. I'm going to be in that gym.
yeah.
And it used to be everybody knew where I was going to be. I was going to be out there on a horse. Well, now it's a little bit more weather controlled. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
it's been amazing to kind of get down this rabbit hole with athletes and then watch them be successful.
Well, and especially how you see them change and evolve as they're going too. And so it's like the kid that comes in slouched over, like I said, with one of the kids that trains here, he's 21 now. His younger brother started when he was 14 or 15. And when the older one first started, he bench pressed 200 pounds and his shoulders were rolled forward. He played no sports in high school. His family was first generation, coming from Albania. So his parents went through all of Soviet Albania and all of the oppression. And you know, I always make fun of him because he shows up in like a 1984 Mercedes, and I'm like, in Soviet Albania, this is the only car.
Is it a diesel?
Oh yeah, yep,
Oh yeah, of course it is.
yep. It's a 300D, and his
Very
dad
very
fixed it up.
Rocky-ish.
I was like, there was one day I go, Ivan Drago called. He wants his car back.
That's exactly what I had pictured in my mind when they drive out to the cabin and they're all in their Mercedes.
Yep. And so when he first started coming here, it was like in college, he's doing like the Dungeons and Dragons like as a get together or whatever as like a hobby. His shoulders are slouched forward, no confidence or anything. But you could tell that like he's not a dumb kid. He's enthusiastic, and he goes, "I'm going to see you all the time. I'm going to be here 4 days a week or whatever." And I was like, "Oh, okay. We'll see how this goes." And now I just can't get rid of him. Like he is absolutely addicted. He did his first powerlifting meet in June, and he squatted 455. He benched 300, and he deadlifted 500. Going from a kid that was going to Planet Fitness, or there's a place called Club Fitness that's like $10 a month, and one of his other friends that a little bit more serious, he's our only kid that ran like a 4.5 on laser. He was a D2 soccer player. He used to go to Lightning Fitness, and Lightning Fitness is probably one of the best gyms in the world right now, and it's 35 minutes away. But the two of them were friends, and the kid playing Dungeons and Dragons mentioned my house, and he was training with me and West Side Barbell and all this stuff, and the other kid's like, what do you know about that? That's You're not supposed to know anything about that. And like when they were at Club Fitness, the one that went to Lightning was like, this kid knew nothing. He was going to injure himself. It was a liability. And then 2 years later, he comes to, and he's like, oh, you have a Thompson fat pad. You have a squat bar. You have two safety bars, one for JM press and one for box squatting. It was like, oh, maybe I'll start coming here.
It's amazing how the word gets out and those kids become family. I
Oh
know
yeah.
we had a tote rack. It used to be in the old gym when you walk by in the garage, and then that's where we would put all of our totes from
Yep.
stuff that we didn't want in the house, a little bit of storage area. And a lot of them said like my daughter's names. So like Emma memories or Casey memories. And it was just all stuff that they had accumulated through their life that really wasn't much. It may be some ribbons, it may be some old shirts or whatever. Well, then I'd come in one day and I'd walk by there, and then you could see where they had taken some tape and put it over another tote, and it'd be like Mike's stuff. Well, Mike became family, and he felt like
Yeah.
he needed a tote with his memory stuff. So yeah, it's amazing how those bonds get formed, and you spend so much time with each other that I guess it is to say that that would happen.
Oh yeah. And like with all of these kids, that when I first started training anyone, it was I would prepare for like a strongman competition, and before I took over one of the garage bays, I was just lifting outside. I have a walkout basement, so I'd put the crash pads down, and I'd be log pressing. And in 2020, my neighbor, he was going into his freshman year of high school. He's 5'3", 95 pounds, and is like, "Hey, can we come over and lift weights?" The world shut down, and I was like, "Well, I'd rather you over here lifting weights rather than." I was just thinking kids are going to go out and smash mailboxes or do something stupid. So I was like, yeah, come on over. And my wife, 2 weeks into the pandemic, is like, you're going to risk your month-old daughter. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm okay with this. We're going to roll with it.
That's how we got started too. The world shut down, and kids were actively looking for something to do.
Well,
And
and especially where like, and this goes into that whole rabbit hole of like conspiracies and stuff like that, where it's like, if you don't give kids an outlet, they're going to get anxious and go insane. You need, I mean, that's the whole ADHD thing, where it's like, if you just don't take away gym class and recess, you're probably good.
they they can only handle so much of the phone. As much as we think they're on it too much, they still reach a point where it starts affecting their mental health if they don't get out and do something and be around other kids and be active. They're not really built for the sedentary lifestyle that they've grown accustomed to.
Yeah, and that's one. I mean, as you know, my oldest daughter is 5, and she has brittle bone disease, and that's one of the things that I am most aware of, is because she's broken the same bone 3 times this year. She's actually got surgery on Monday. Finding ways to be able to have her do something, like her and I are going fishing, where it's like I'll wheel a wheelchair out to whatever boat ramp, and we might not catch anything, but as long as we're getting outside and we're doing something that doesn't involve watching Blippy, we're we're winning.
That's the whole deal. And the more I'm around these kids, the more I see they may be actually envious of how we grew up. The
Oh,
music they listen to, the stuff they watch. Yeah, there's a very envious, like I'm envious of the Dazed and Confused when you watch the 70s and how that era worked
yeah,
out. I think they're almost envious of the 90s.
I can definitely see that. And it's also hilarious going back to, the kid from his family's from Albania. And it's like he's listened to like the 70s classic rock on like cassette tapes. And I'm just like, that's what I grew up with in the 90s.
We'll get into the song game, and they play it a little different than I do. They play it a little weird, but these kids think they can take me in the song game. So we'll just hit random tunes, and man, they get so mad because, yeah, when I grew up, we listened to 70s.
Yep.
And so I know all of them from like the first chord. And I always played the artist. They want to play the song, which I care
Yep.
less about the song. We always played the artist. And when I was a kid, we hit scan on the radio,
Yep.
and it was a group of guys in the car, and you'd better be fast because
Oh, yeah.
you had to get it before everybody else, and you had to get it before the radio changed.
We would do that with the very first iPods. So in like 2004 in high school, we would be in like a cooking class, and we, because of course we also took cooking class, because it was like, all right, well, I like eating. I'm gonna go over there and do that. We would share a headphone and go head to head with 2 people on shuffle and see who got it the fastest.
Yeah, when they put the name of the artist on the radios, it helped and it hurt. You had to hang a piece of paper over the radio
Oh
so you
yeah,
couldn't see it. But then you knew if a kid was wrong. So that really shored up the rules.
yeah, yeah. My cousin had a 2000, I don't know, 2006 F-350, and it was like, I thought it was amazing that it would come across the, tell you what song was playing, and I'm just like, used to my '93 Suburban, just like, all right, well, we're gonna hope for the best. Oh, I like this song.
we used to run through FM twice and then we'd run through AM once. So you hit scan and it would go that way. You give it enough time for new
Oh yeah,
songs to come on. Them were the rules. And then
yeah.
once it had left that station, you couldn't go back and guess. You could only guess in the 5 seconds or whatever that you got to hear the song before it scanned to the next one.
Yep. Oh, that's a good game.
It was great. It was a wonderful time to grow up in the 90s. But there's a lot of other stuff to get to besides random talk.
Yep.
But when I was researching all this, I definitely have an outline that I want to get to. But when I was researching all this, your family's been here since the mid 1600s.
Yep.
And that's really, I mean, that's amazing. My daughter she had a class at some point and we had to research back family as far as we could. And that's when we found out that my mom's side of the family had came in the early 1600s.
Okay.
So they were some of the first families over.
Oh, wow.
They left France with the Huguenot issues that was going on, and their last name was Purdue.
Oh,
So
okay.
very easily tracked because as branches of the family have split off, you have a university and you have Tyson or Purdue chicken, and then they were
Yep.
fighting with Tyson and all this, but don't really know any of those. I just know as you look at the lineage, that's how it comes through. And
Oh,
then
that's funny.
yeah, there's a lot of wills and testament from the Civil War.
Yep.
Um, and we were able to track back through. My grandpa had enough records and all that. So living here having a family root that's been here a long time is actually really cool. So you live on, or your parents and your brother live on the same farm that you guys bought in the 1600s, aren't they?
Yeah. So my family sailed over from Ipswich, England in 1639, and sometime in the 1640s they moved from the colony in Wethersfield, Connecticut, which is actually in like the basically the central Connecticut, and moved to Brantford, which now my family's farm is in North Brantford. But North Brantford was split off from Brantford in the 1700s because the church was just too far for some people to travel to. So it's right on the North Brantford line. And my brother and my cousin, so my brother runs the farm market that's still there. There's a lot of agritourism, so all of, you know, New Haven County, Connecticut, all of the school systems will go there and do like apple picking and hay rides and stuff like that. And he's got basically like a diner going there. And then my cousin has a vineyard that he opened up probably 7 years ago, maybe. And so he, studied it, went all in, flew out to Napa, hired a consultant, wanted to learn everything about wineries and stuff like that. Of course, farming doesn't make any money. So it all started, my grandfather had a dairy farm in the 1950s. And prior to that, it was just kind of like peddling goods, some fruits, veggies, eggs, and milk, just peddling to New Haven County pretty much. My grandfather decided that he was going to go into the dairy business and he bought a whole herd. He graduated in 1948. So it was just between World War II and the Korean War. And he was like, he's the only son. He's going to try and make something of it. So he went really into dairy farming, and unfortunately, his barn had burnt down, so he lost almost everything. And this was 1973, I think. So after that, he just he my dad and my uncle actually planted like thousands of apple trees. We're like, all right, we're gonna run an orchard now because I don't want to have to put down a bowl that's burning to death.
Whenever I think of an old apple orchard like you're talking about, I think of that Supernatural episode where Sam and Dean had to go fight the scarecrow in the middle of the apple orchard that would come alive
Yeah.
at night. I don't know
Oh yeah.
why. Yeah, I don't know why apple orchards are so scary, but yeah, at night the way those trees are and stuff like that, it's definitely not the place you want to be.
Yeah, you'll get those shadows, especially when there isn't leaves on it, where it's just like, all right, what's going on? And of course, because it's an apple orchard, you're always going to have deer and coyotes and mice and everything's moving around because, especially with our farm, there was the Branford River runs through it. So you have your woods and your creek kind of further down the hill. So all of the woodland critters are going to be coming out and going to wherever the dropped apples are. So you're always going to have some kind of activity going on.
Now, you had mentioned it earlier in the podcast, and for people that don't know you or don't know your story, you kind of stumbled down a Jay Schroeder idea. Like, from what I've researched, Jay, he got hurt really bad and
Yep.
he got into training to bring himself back. Now his style was maybe a little different than you, but you
Yep.
talked about being in a snowmobile accident, and the snowmobile had metal tracks on it, and your leg got caught underneath it, and it essentially dang near ripped your leg off. It was just grinding on your leg,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
had to have it all put back together, right?
Yeah. So that I was really lucky with that. So it was my dad had gotten his snowmobile stuck. He was actually riding on the river, even though the hayride road runs adjacent to it. But he was like, you know what, I'm gonna go on the river and see how it goes. And it was 0 degrees, about a foot and a half of snow, and it was so cold out that the river obviously was like just a trickle instead of 2 or 3 feet deep. And so the snowmobile collapsed underneath the weight of the track basically just fell through. And as he called up my brother and I. We were planning on actually going to the UFC fights at or not UFC, but one of those knockoff brands. Might have been Strikeforce at the time. I don't remember. My brother was into MMA, and we had free tickets. And he gets a call from my dad at like 5 p.m. and he's like, "Hey, my snowmobile's stuck. Can you come and help lift it out of the river, and we'll go on our way?" So we're like, "Yeah, we'll go do that." And we go down, and of course, I was stronger than both of them, so I'm lifting on the track, and I'm trying to lift it up and back onto the ice shelf that it had fallen through. And as I did that, the ice shelf that I was standing on broke through, and so the studs on the track, because there was 2 rows of the studs, so it grips the ice a little bit better, and the track landed on my right leg, and it was just the inside of the calf, and so it had shred everything, severed an artery, and the bone was showing. And of course, I'm an idiot at the time, and I'm just cursing as much as I could. And my dad's like, "What's this moron doing? Why is he yelling so much?" And he turns off the snowmobile because he was trying to like goose it from the front to try and convince the track to grip the ice and keep going forward, going backwards to get back onto the ice. And so he shuts it off and sees blood everywhere, and he's like, "Oh, they get the track off of my leg because I was still like deadlifting it to hold it away from digging further into the bone." And they were just like, "Oh crap, this is not good." And thankfully, my brother also lifts, so the two of them were willing to lift me up, carry me up the riverbank onto the snowmobile that my brother and I took to go and find where he was. And then my brother drove me holding my severed leg, where it was he's holding it in one arm, trying to drive with the other arm, and got me up to where our farm market was, where the ambulance was. They eventually got there. They were like probably five. It felt like a half hour, but I guess it was only like 5 minutes before they got there. And thankfully, being in Connecticut, it was like Yale New Haven Health was the closest hospital, and it was 9 miles away. But it was an adventure. And then because there is no money in farming, my uncle has done well with the construction business. So he's built a bunch of houses for a who's who of Yale graduate doctors and orthopedic surgeons and plastic surgeons. So as this happened, he basically within the 2 weeks before my surgery calls up every doctor he knows and goes, my nephew's severed an artery. He needs a free flap surgery to basically take a chunk of his leg and put it in his calf. And he goes to one of the plastic surgeons that he built a house for. "If you were to have this done, who would you have do it?" And the guy mentioned this one like world renowned plastic surgeon that was right there, and he was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, we're gonna use him." And they did a fantastic job, where it was like I was I had no idea what was going to happen after that, where I thought that just walking was going to be the goal and I'd never power lift again and never do anything. And as I was just, listening, I'm on Instagram constantly, just trying to learn as much as I could. At the time, it was like Mark Bell's Powercast, learning absolutely everything that I could as I'm just bored out of my mind, wanted to know how I can recover. And I think I was cleared to, so that they reattach a vein from my quad into the artery that was severed. And so I have a chunk of my vastus lateralis on the outside of the quad is basically just, they use a microsurgery and stitched it all back together. And so once I was cleared to actually be weight bearing, I just used like trap bar deadlifts, and because I was only cleared to have my foot not elevated for like 3 sets of 15 minutes per day for the first month that I was out of the rehab facility. And so it was just slowly coming back. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to sign up for a powerlifting meet. And even if I can just do squat the bar, deadlift the bar, and then bench press, I'll be happy with this. And within 16 weeks of being cleared to be weight bearing, I squatted 425 in reps, benched like 285 or something like that, and deadlifted, I think, 515. And it was my worst total ever, but it was the most fun because my leg was still bandaged up. And when I had signed up, I had emailed Gene Reichlich at the time, the first guy to bench 900, and he put on the RPS meets around here. And he's like, whatever you need to do for your leg, if you're injured but you want to compete, we don't care. Like, we will accommodate you with whatever you need. And so as I'm warming up, I've got this bandage going from basically my ankle all the way up to my knee. And people are like, what happened to you? And so that's been my big claim to fame ever since.
Now, what did you find helped get you back the quickest? I mean, you've got a calf that's the main injury, but then you had all that work done on your quad. I know you worked a conjugate system, so everything was the focus, but where did you prioritize?
So at first it was just walking. So when I first got injured, I thought, okay, everything is weak because when you spend 8 weeks in a bed, there's nothing there. So then having those restrictions of, okay, I can spend three three sessions of 15 minutes, and it progressively went up to 45 minutes or so of do what you need to do with shower, whatever it is, take care of all of that stuff. But then, okay, I might have 5 minutes to do something. What can I do? And so that's when I actually bought the Kabuki transformer bar as an excuse, because I said, okay, I don't want to have to hold on to anything. I'm going to hold on to the rack and just do like a Hatfield squat and just build up the strength to be able to do. It was almost more of like a 1x20, where it was, okay, what can I do now? And then just slowly progressing it, because when you get injured, it's essentially just linear day to day. And like, this might have been my critique of Stu McGill's The Back Mechanic, or I forget. He had one that was a little bit more in depth than The Back Mechanic, but he was saying that it's not about absolute strength, it's about strength endurance. But then, like, how do you get to strength endurance is always through max strength first. So it's like, I can't do reps of something if I can't do, a rep first. So it was just get to where I need to be. So with a lot of it was just your typical whatever the physical therapist told me to do for physical therapy exercises of stand on one leg against a counter and all of that stuff. And then on my own, I would take more of like a Cal Dietz kind of approach to strengthening and getting more blood flow through the capillaries. So I wanted that pressure from something heavy. That way I'm actually promoting more blood flow through all of the free flap, so that that vein is gonna work well and actually get things where it needs to go, or create new pathways for capillaries, because not everything, you know nothing was there before. Everything that was there before was gone. So it was like, all right, we need to take this approach of we need to find a what. I think there's a guy, Muscle Bill, on Instagram that had said something about having some issues like that, where it was like his face gets really red because there's not, like, blood flow doesn't come down as well. His body kind of finds new ways. It's almost like a river system where it's like it's going to find a new way to get to where it needs to be. And so I kind of took that approach of, okay, how do I increase pressure? But I was also terrified, when you have an injury like that, I thought that the free flap could just like slide off at some point. Where I was like, if a soccer ball kicks me, it's going to slide off. This is terrible. This is the end of the world. Don't come up within 30 feet of me with anything. And it was just taking everything day to day. And just, I think it was more of like being able to know when to push and when not to push. Because originally it was Hatfield squats and trap bar deadlifts, because I wanted to, my theory at the time was, okay, I can't stand on one leg right now, but if I can trap bar deadlift my body weight as I'm standing on both legs, I'm going to overload that leg, even if it's only 30% or 40%. And even now, I still have asymmetries that I'll never have corrected because I'm missing a chunk of my quad.
That's what I was wondering, is how bad were hip shifts and all the things now from when you were training then? How cognitive do you have to be on where your body weight is?
So I don't worry too much about it, as weird as it sounds. Like, I know I'm compensating with the left side of my body, but as long as it's not too egregious, like, I'm going to fail the lift before it becomes a problem. Just because it's basically like it's going to either get by or I'm going to fail. But I'm not really pushing. And this is probably 8 years. This is 8 years later almost, where it's like I probably should be focusing more on not so much the low hanging fruit, but like that last 10% where I haven't been focusing on the single leg strength or like this single leg calf raises on a step or something like that, because I was finding that by doing the bilateral things most of the time, it's not every time, but like by doing compound lifts and just accepting that I'm going to look a little bit more ugly with it, I'm still able to do things that I didn't think were going to be possible. So I wasn't wasting as much time waiting for everything to be perfect, where I knew nothing was ever going to be perfect. So I'd never start doing any of the fun stuff that I wanted to if I only did the rehab, make sure everything tries to look a little bit prettier.
You just did a 600 in your home gym with wraps, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. So when before the injury, my best squat was 501 bare knees, and I had gotten credit just from bad record keeping in a powerlifting meet for a 600-pound deadlift in 2017, and it took me 3 years to actually deadlift 600. And then with the squat, it was much longer of just being consistent with, I vary between max effort and brief maximal tension and more of like small off and, high volume and all of these things. And it's just like everything works, but knowing when something works and when it doesn't. And I think this was Zach Goodman mentioned, how he always talks about sequencing. And, a lot of people just randomly choose what lifts to do. But when he said how important sequencing was, where it's like, you have to know, okay, if I do this for this rep scheme, how is it going to translate into the next thing and the next thing? And so that was kind of like an epiphany just in the last 2 years, where it was like, oh, I need to make sure that I'm actually creating the adaptation and I can actually track how much of an adaptation I'm making and where it's correlating to, the next thing, the next thing. So kind of creating these cycles that compound on each other, as opposed to, hey, this was this Mike Teixeira had his idea of the like emerging strategies where he'll do the same thing and then only change one variable and see how that training cycle works. And so as with Mike Scherer, it was like when you know that this one thing works really well, you'll know when to plug it in as you're going into like a meet prep. And so kind of blending those two things where it's like, okay, if you know that this creates an adaptation at this time, because not everything's going to create the adaptation for too long, how do I translate that into the next thing that I know is going to create an adaptation? And so just figuring that out has helped me a lot in the last 2 years, especially with like the bench press, especially where it was, I'd bench anywhere between 315 and 350, and then I'd have a nagging shoulder, and then I'd go back down to 295 or so. And now just this past like 2 years, we kind of figured out that just doubling down on listening to whether it was Zach Goodman or Michael Fahey, where it was like, oh, okay, we need more reps, less reps, more sets. Make sure that each set is hard. You don't have to fail all the time, but like failing isn't the end of the world. And if we're trying to recruit more motor units and if we're trying to promote type 2 muscle fibers, we need to be heavy. We need to try and move it fast. And we need to do this as often as we can.
You hit on an interesting point in there. So I think I'm becoming more cognizant of the sequencing instead of bouncing around a little bit, especially in the bench press. So, if you have your straight bench, then what would come next, and what would come after that, and what would come after that, so that when you come back to your straight bench, it's bigger. And
exactly,
you're seeing the weak point. And I started getting down this rabbit hole of a 2-board press with athletes,
mm-hmm.
and I started noticing that in some athletes, their 2-board press would be less than their bench press.
Yep.
So then I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to raise their bench press, I have to be able to raise their tricep strength or,
yep.
And so then we would start looking at that. Well, then that started hitting like, okay, there actually is a sequence to this to narrow down what is wrong and how to program it and how to set it up. So we might come off the 2-board and then we might go into a floor press and then we might go into an incline and then come back around so that we're slowly hammering the shoulders and the triceps harder to try to create that bigger bench press. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or am I down a different path?
This was something that after hearing, I always call it the Hoff story from Michael Fahey, where when he first was talking to Dave Hoff, he couldn't conceive of holding 500 pounds or, benching 500. And Hoff's just like, oh, have you ever held 500? No. And that got into the whole like heavy holds and stuff like that you see Josh Bryant and all these other people doing for overload, and you're actually building up the mechanical tension at that top, because as we know, strength is going to radiate. So the brilliance of what Fahey did was he's going with a 4-board down to a 2-board down to no board, and he had joked that kids are stupid, they're not going to remember. And so the 4 becomes the 2, 2 weeks after doing the 4, they're going to hit the same numbers. And then the 0, and then all of a sudden you're up by quite a bit because the kids don't remember. And I kind of took that and I went to a further extreme because I've got fairly long arms. So I'll do like a 12-week cycle of 5, 3, 1, 4, 2, 0 and give 2 weeks. But unlike Zach or Fahey, I'm not doing it 2 days a week. I'm probably taking a slower, more conservative approach than them by having that as a main lift. And then I'll hit like a close grip with 2 chains or 3 chains. And we're just hammering that for our 4 to 8 reps. And we joke that we have a 5 rep max on all of our assistance lifts where it's close grip, incline, JM press with the safety bar, floor press. All of these are our second lifts that we're hitting in that 4 to 8 rep range. But we have a 5 rep max that's on our chalkboards because I have chalkboards everywhere. But our slogan for it is 4 is on the board, because if you hit your 5 rep max, we're going to give you, if you only hit 4, we're going to put it on the board as your 5 rep max. but you can't go up and weight until you actually hit that again. And so it's like, it adds a little bit more of the competitiveness, especially as like some of the kids are chasing me, and they'll say, "I'm coming for you, Steve," and they'll go from 100 pounds behind to 60 pounds behind to 20 pounds behind. And as we're going, everything leads into the next thing. We had an issue, not an issue, but we were joking that Christo, the Albanian kid, he was only like 20 pounds behind me on it was close grip incline or close grip flat bench with two chains, and he was like 20 pounds behind me. And I was like, maybe it's not translating for you. Like, I don't know how you're so good at these assistance lifts and your bench is just terrible. And then, he did 300 in the meet, and now he just bench pressed 335, like moving way faster than I've ever bench pressed 335. And he just missed 345. And I was like, oh, okay, nope, these are translating. This is working.
What I found, and I think maybe Bill Gillespie helped me understand this, was we don't always take into consideration the other things we're doing. So the bench press shows it first. Like if your squat's up and your deadlift's up, your bench press is going to be down.
Yep.
If your bench press is up, one of those other two is going to be down or stalled out. It works in waves, and not to panic. Realize, hey, take the PRs and these other lifts, let this one kind of mellow, and then before too long, the change will happen and that lift will start growing with the other lifts.
Well, and especially with that too, understanding a lot of like the Charlie Francis kind of stuff where it's like, as long as you're hitting 95% on the faster things. So like with sprints and jumps, I'm very inconsistent. And, so on top of having my leg injury there, I have a growth plate injury from when I was 12. So I have titanium screws that are basically impinging my hips. So like I can't sit crisscross, and I can't squat wide like your multiply lifters. And so it's like with these sprints and the jumps, I'm very inconsistent. But you'll see that if you're close on your sprints and jumps, your squat and your deadlift, like the strength is still there, because those are your indicators of relative strength, and then also of where your nervous system is at. Because as we know, like when you're dehydrated or you don't sleep well, usually you can get away with sleep for like a day. But if you go 2 days with less than, let's say, 5 or 6 hours of sleep, you're going to see it in your sprints first, then in your jumps, which you can kind of cope with, whether it's ammonia or whatever mechanism that you can use to one time override the system. But even when you have a bad day on those, you still might have a good squat or a good deadlift, or whatever your choice of a main lift is, because you have a lot more time on those. So like you can take the time to create the tension and it might still be there as long as everything else is fairly on point.
That's what I spend most time discussing with athletes in the gym, is because they get frustrated with their jumps. I was here, now I'm here. Well, you didn't get worse. Something in your life changed,
Yeah.
and we have to figure that out.
Well, and especially where it's with a lot of kids, it's anxiety. I joke with one of the kids, so the kid that runs like a 4.5, Division II soccer his freshman year, and then he dropped out of school, so he's working construction, and he's got a long-term relationship with a girlfriend in Florida, and we're in Connecticut. And we joke that like he'll rotate between lifting here and lifting with his like bodybuilding friends. Every 3 or 4 weeks, we joke, sometimes you just need to just go on a bender to Florida for like 2 weeks. He spends so much time and stress worrying about life, being 21 and trying to figure out, because he wants to move to Florida, and worrying about a job and money and all these stressors. And I'm just like, go on your bender to Florida. Don't pick up a weight while you're there. And when he comes back after 4 weeks of being consistent here and then 2 weeks off, he's beating me by 20 pounds on lifts that 2 weeks earlier we were dead even on.
And when it became very obvious to me was we had a thrower, And his sophomore year, he took second in state. And he only lost by a foot. It wasn't much
Mhm.
that he didn't get first by. Well, 2 weeks later, he goes to, oh, where'd he go? USATF, I believe, and
Mhm.
took second through a 20-foot PR.
Wow.
And he couldn't figure out why. And I was, I had to sit down and think about it a little bit. Well, we narrowed it down to the volume that he was acquiring running
Mhm.
had drug his javelin down
Yep.
20, 21 feet, essentially. This last year, he didn't do the running events. He just threw,
Mhm.
which he's a fast kid, and it hurt that he didn't do the running, but javelin is his thing.
Right.
He did not do that. Well, there was nobody in the state that was within 30 feet of him.
Yep.
So he put the 20 back on and then some, but he wasn't dragging it down with all the excess running, and then nobody could touch him. And
Yep.
that's when it became obvious to me is there's more indicators to this and what's going on in their life than just what we think is out there.
Oh, definitely. And that was one thing because when I first got the just jump mat, I used to do like a readiness jump every day, and it was like as soon as you wake up, go outside in the garage and just jump. And for about a year, I was doing that just out of curiosity. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was after listening to Bird and Randy Huntington talking about like deep water immersion for lymph drainage and all this other stuff. My in-laws have a pool, so we would go over there and just hang out in the pool and just relax. The very next day, I would jump and I'd be up a solid 2 or 3 inches, and it was like, oh, maybe recovery and just relaxing really does play a significant role in everything.
It's pretty hard to get young athletes to relax. They
Yeah.
think they're relaxed, but really there's so much going on in their life that it's very hard for them to totally let their guard down and truly relax.
And that's the fun one too with sprinting because like I'm no expert at sprinting. I'm not fast. I've never been athletic. Like my siblings are much more athletic. I was always the nerdy kid that had the leg injury and was into dog sledding rather than any real sports. Like teaching these kids in a 40-yard dash, it's like you see the kids that are pushing so hard at 20 yards and you just give them the cue, dude, you look like you're constipated. Like just relax your face. And then they just, shave 2/10 off of a 40-yard dash because they're trying too hard and they're tensing up too much.
The problem I ran into, and I don't know, this was mind blowing to me, is they somewhere along the line forgot how to run their fastest. They're so conditioned to condition
Yep.
that we used to have to stand out there and tell them, no, dude, you got to run fast. Like, and then they would always shut it down before the last timer. And it's like, you can tell that they've just
Oh
ran
yeah.
gas or just like, no, we're going as fast as we can. I promise we're not going to wear you out. This isn't going to be 100 of these. It's just going to be 2 or 3.
Yep.
And we spent more of our time teaching kids how to literally just run through the timers than we did anything else.
Oh yeah, because they all want to like have that big plant on that last step as soon as they cross the line, and it's just like, no, dude, just run. For me, I think my yard is 175 feet wide, so we have 40 yards, and then slow down before you hit the fence. And they all try. There's probably 15 yards between the 40 finish line and the fence, but it's like when you know that you're running fast, you need that fence to stop you. And a lot of the kids don't do that. So then it's like, all right, I'm gonna race you. You better not lose to the fat old crippled power lifter because that's gonna be embarrassing. And they'll shave as much as one of the kids shaved like half a second off, where it was like he went from like 5.7s that day to 5.29. That's still his record on the board right now at 6 foot 250.
Yeah, sometimes they just don't know what we think they know, or they've been
Yeah.
conditioned to do something totally different.
Oh yeah. And that was another good one though, was the stronger, more athletic former D2 kid. Like when he first showed up here, the youngest athlete was still in high school and was playing football, and his best split times he could run a 4.7, but he just never could put anything together. So he was usually in that like 5.1 to 5.3. And the first time that he saw the other kid that was 3 years older than him run in the backyard, and I was like, I didn't know the kid at all. And I go, Pat, all right, run 80% for your warm up. And he runs a 4.7. And I'm just like, no, I said, 70, 80%. Like, calm down, dude. And he's like, that was. I was like, no, you're ridiculous. And he puts down a 4.55 and a 4.54. And I have the free lap because I was using a speed tech with like, start at the line as the trigger. So that it's not as, it's probably a tenth off of a Brower. But then I have a free lap that I have at 10 yards and I get the split time and it's like a 10-yard fly at 0.91. So I have two different devices running and I'm like 22 and a half miles an hour. Okay, this kid is fast. And the kid still in high school at the time is like, he sounded like a herd of wildebeest. Like, what is going on? It was like, see, and at the time, Pat was, he's 200 pounds squatting 585 in knee sleeves and, sumo deadlifted 650 or 630 at, because he was going to lightning fitness. So he was just doing bodybuilding bodybuilding and powerlifting and didn't know that he could actually develop speed and power. He was like all of us where it was like, oh, just get generally stronger and you're going to improve. But seeing what he could do really cemented to the younger kid, oh, maybe Steve's not full of crap with this. Even if it wasn't like Pat's jumps were still lower than they should have been. But from playing soccer for so long, he's able to actually use the elasticity that he has in his foot when he's just putting the hammer down.
That is the one thing I think listening to Tony Villani helped me with so much is like we'll set our sprints up like you just talked about, just kind of 50, 60%. We're not doing much, 70, 80%. And then we'll kick it up to max. Well, like you said, the 70, 80s, they're the fastest. And then the kids start learning how much perceived effort they need to put in or how relaxed they are. And then before too long, they become more efficient with what they're doing. And now they can play longer in the game on the conditioning they have because they're not fighting themselves.
Right. And they're not so focused on the speed that they like shut down the brain so that they're still actually able to run the brain processing everything. And that's why like when you look at like the NBA where it's like your slowest players are actually your all-time best because they're playing real slow until they don't have to play slow. And that was another nugget that Pat had realized in high school where it was like he wasn't doing all of the conditioning that the entire team was doing. And he'd try to be as slow as possible until he needed to use that 22 and a half miles an hour when he absolutely needed to. But most of the time he's jogging at, 9 or 10 miles an hour or whatever it is, which is, 30 or 40%. Whereas all these other kids that top out at 15 miles an hour or 16 miles an hour, they're running at 80% and they're gassing.
Yes. Setting up the timers, letting kids work through it, trying not to overcoach it. They start putting together what speed they can play at. And if it wasn't for Tony Villani, I never would have looked at it like that. But now all of a sudden we're having way better conversations on the timers about, look, you gained 100th. Was it worth all that effort to gain 100th? Or was it worth all that effort to gain a 10th? In most cases, it wasn't. So let's just play a little smarter, a little more efficient, use the strengths you have, and your game will increase.
Well, and so this is one that I was talking to one of my friends, Bryce Woolman. He's 6'7", 380 pounds, and he played either D2 or D3 football. But he was saying how like he never really in high school understood the game, and it's like a lot of the issues are you can't show your speed or your power or your strength on the field if you don't know what you're supposed to do. So you're naturally inhibiting yourself if you don't actually understand the game. And so like these guys that should be in the NFL but aren't. It's like if they had better coaching in the actual sport to understand where they needed to actually express what they can express, they'd be a lot better off. It comes down to, and this was, I think Fahey had mentioned this, where it was like, once he taught one task to some lineman or whatever, it was like the kid becomes a superstar just because he knows what his job is in that one play.
And that can carry over to all aspects of life. Sometimes we don't always know exactly what it is that we need to be doing. So we never are able to achieve any sort of mastery at it.
Yeah, I mean that kind of goes into this entire conversation where neither of us went to school for this, and here we are. We go down that rabbit hole and kind of figure out what we're interested in, and get really good at what we think we need to learn, and we seek out people all over the country that are also having those same conversations of, oh, okay, what are we going to actually get from each other mutually, because I'm curious and you're curious. Somebody here is going to have answers to something that I'm looking for.
And you kind of hit on this. This is where I wanted to go. We're starting to get to where I wanted to go with the podcast. You mentioned earlier you're a nerd. Yep. I'm a nerd. We have some interesting conversations that are very nerd based. Well, somehow along the way, I had listened to a few clips of Charlie Kirk, and he was talking about economics. I think he was debating, which he debated everybody.
Yeah.
But he was debating on how much was school worth it, and the opposite side was trying to express that it was worth it. The natural Charlie Kirk stuff. I'm not rehashing anything original, but he started naming off economists. And the kid that he was debating had no clue who any of these economists were, yet he was an economy major. So I was like, well, being the nerd I am, I'm going to look into these guys. And somehow that sparked a conversation between me and you.
Yep.
And we got down this whole economics rabbit hole. And I think the issue lies in economics is we think it's about money. And it's not about money. It's about human nature and predicting patterns that people will do. And I think it has more relation to the weight room than what we want to give it credit.
Yeah. And I think with this too, we got to define that there's a bunch of different camps within economics where, you have your Marxist idea of equality and labor determining everything and really, really driving everything. And if everything's equal, then everyone will prosper equally. And then you have your Keynesian model of during recession, if governments spend money on things, and sometimes they don't even go into what things, just keeping people busy will spur the economy and keep everything going. That kind of gets abused, but that's your mainstream Keynesian economics model. And then beyond that, you have the Austrian school, which would be more like Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, where they're saying, well, everything comes down to individuals making decision making based on what they value, and value is inherently subjective. And so you can't try to centrally plan like Keynes or with Marx, because one individual or one AI doesn't know what I as an individual or you as an individual value. And so that's where we really have to open it up to being open-minded to who are we talking to and what do people value. Because as you know, like my bias, as I said, was individualism and voluntary association, which is the very libertarian Austrian school perspective. And as we're probably going to go down, like everyone has a different perspective based on how they grew up and what they've dealt with to influence their ideas and perspectives on everything.
That's unique because as I've gotten into this, I've started learning that your political parties, whether you're a conservative or you're a liberal, are going to lean one way or the other. Kind of like you said, you're a libertarian, so you lean a little more Hayek, Mises. Your liberals lean a little bit more Keynesian or Keynes. however you
So
want to look at that.
even with that, I would say that both liberal and conservatives lean, especially like if you're defining conservatism as those that are in the Republican Party right now, everyone except for Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, I would consider Keynesians just based on the size of the budget.
That's true. And all that stems back to like McCulloch versus Maryland, whenever we decided that, Congress could do what they needed to do to function. And we have
Right.
ran into this huge government now that the forefathers never really thought they wanted.
Right. And so that's what's interesting too, because it's like when we talk about incentives in economics, where it's like everyone and every entity has an incentive. And it's like, well, what's the incentive of government? And a lot of people in that more Marxist camp would be like, well, to take care of the people, like take care of the citizens. And it's like, no, from a realist realpolitik perspective, it's like the incentive of government is to grow. It's to expand and create more power for government to ensure that it persists, because governments get toppled, governments default, revolutions happen, coups happen, everything happens where that one government may not maintain its power for as long as it might hope.
Now, before we lose people, we're eventually going to turn this into the weight room and coaching. We just are setting the stage right now. But the way I looked at it, and maybe that's where I was coming up with political parties and economist theory, was up until FDR, it was pretty laissez-faire. It was pretty Hayek, let the weak fall off. You got to be strong enough to survive.
So this is where I would say yes, except for during World War One.
Yeah, I would. And
So
even then, it wasn't what FDR brought to the table. So
right, but you still had, I think it was like 70 or 90% income tax, like the creation of income tax. You had the creation of the Federal Reserve. What was it? 1906, I think, was really the start of, under Teddy Roosevelt, was the start of the FBI. So you did have a lot of these more authoritarian ideas that were coming to the forefront in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's why it wasn't just Woodrow Wilson, but Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt. These ideas were percolating. And what was it? I was just learning about Werner something or other. I can't think of his last name. That was in the early 1900s trying to figure out why socialism wasn't working in America. And it was really like the contrast between like the Germans and the Russians, that are much more of like a collectivist kind of perspective of the nation is the nation and your duty is to serve. More of like it didn't have the, what you would call in the US, like the rugged individualism that was, whether the American Revolution or expanding west, where it was like in the 1800s you had essentially, and even the 1700s, you have this infinite expansion of just go west to seek adventure. And actually, even into the 1800s, like late 1800s, early 1900s, you still have Alaska, as I'm wearing the last great race, the Iditarod, where it's like, even today, anyone that's seeking adventure goes to Alaska.
and there's a lot of truth to that. It's our identity as a nation is way different, and some of it may be our infancy. As far as other places in the world, we're
Well,
not as old.
especially when you look at it from like an evolutionary perspective too. You're in all of these old cultures where everyone's been there for so long, and there's so much of this, whether it's monarchies or whatever, throughout feudalism, where it was like each culture was basically, I mean, it sounds terrible to say, like it's almost like eugenics, where it's like you're breeding them to be obedient. And that's why, like, when you contrast like early Americans being almost rabid individualists, when you look at Benjamin Franklin seeking out Thomas Paine, and everyone thought that Thomas Paine was actually a ghostwriter for Benjamin Franklin of why the revolution should occur. Like, because we're the people that fled. My bias, of course, is England because it was, that's where my family left in the 1600s, and all the people that stayed, and you kind of see that with like the people in America that didn't want to be a part of the revolution, they fled to Canada. And so you have all of these cultures where it's like just comply, just be obedient, don't ruffle any feathers. Maybe it's not that bad. And when you look at the taxes that really triggered, the American Revolution, it was nothing compared. Like it'd be like state income tax today without even a federal income tax, or all of the um, taxes on other things like gas or whatever. Like these people were well ahead of where you would expect them to be.
They foresaw something. Yeah, they were forward thinking,
Yeah,
and on top of being forward thinking, they were not people that wanted to be pushed around. They and
yeah,
somehow they convinced the masses there was enough. I mean, if you look at what it took to create a revolution, like you said, the majority of people really did not want to fight. They were
right.
okay in the situation we were in. We'll just pay a little more money. It'll be fine. It was only really a handful of people that kind of started this. And then the tactics they used to get people on board, we never talk about, but it was pretty rough. Like, you're going to fight or you're going to leave or we're going to burn your plantation down. We're going to
Yeah,
evict you.
yeah. It's one of those where I wish we put more focus on the actual nuances of history rather than just memorizing facts and dates of Lexington, Concord, or all of these things where it's like memorizing dates doesn't help you as much as knowing the actual story. And as we say with like Michael Fahey's a storyteller. The success in remembering what he's telling you is because he tells you something in a story and people remember stories. So like all of these names and references that we've dropped already, it's because as we're having conversations, we're telling a story based on what we remembered from the last time that we told it. And that becomes a new story. And so it's one of those things where when you only memorize names and dates, nothing's retained. And the only way that you can actually capture that back and see the benefits of like why it's so important, like why Benjamin Franklin is such an interesting character, or why Thomas Jefferson and whoever else, Alexander Hamilton, like why they were butting heads over trying to create the first Federal Reserve, the first national bank. You would understand everything a lot better, and you'd actually have a better understanding of why everything came out the way that it did.
Yeah, when you get into the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalists and how they decided to amend the Constitution to make everybody happy and add the Bill of Rights and all of that stuff played into putting the government together, but they had to fight it out. And I would imagine those were some fierce debates that never really get talked about.
Oh, definitely. Especially where like just going back to like middle school or high school where it's like, oh yeah, these guys all got together and they wrote this, and it's just like that's not how it worked. It's much more nuanced, and I mean, it's almost like a Dale Carnegie, like how to win friends and influence people, where it's like you would have a master class, like you might be the most successful person if you actually understood like how they were able to actually get things done in the way that they did and why and what they were actually saying to each other during all of those meetings that wasn't written down. Because like one of the things through the leg injury, or even in my day job as an auditor, the biggest weakness that everyone has everywhere all the time is communication. So it's like if you understood how people make decisions and how you convince other people, like you could take over the world if you actually master that.
And to say, they were good communicators and what they wrote down was amazing to read. They also weren't above a little bit of violence.
Yeah.
They would
Oh,
duel,
definitely.
you get the Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr. They had no problem dueling, or they had no problem throwing down
Well,
in the
wasn't it?
middle of a debate.
they had to outlaw dueling during the revolution because most people don't want to actually fight and don't want to kill each other. And I mean that's the whole conspiracy around like the Prussian school system now, where guys were asking their friends to shoot them so that they didn't actually have to fight in the war too. And like George Washington had to ban that because he was losing so many men, because it's horrifying what true violence actually is. And I think a lot of people that have never been punched in the face are always the ones that are advocating for it. And I mean, growing up, my younger brother's 3 years younger than me, but he was undefeated as a amateur MMA fighter, and he had a mediocre record as a professional MMA fighter. But like, there's a big difference between a play fight and a real fight, and people that don't understand that don't really have any idea what they're advocating for.
Well, and that is the basis of the movie The Patriot, right? Like,
Yeah,
he did not want to go back to Valley Forge. He remembered the violence and how it affected his life, and he had hit it well because his kids didn't even know what kind of man he was. But yeah, guys that live through that aren't in a huge hurry to get back to it.
well, and that was interesting with I know this is going to be controversial, but the Martyr Made podcast, with the first episode of the German perspective of World War I, with what's his name, Daryl Cooper, was explaining like how everything came to be within Germany to set up for why the Weimar Republic fell, and how Hitler came to power, and who he was, and what he did, and what he had to experience in World War I. Because anyone in any of those trenches at all at any time in World War I were experiencing one of the most horrifying things that mankind could ever conceive of. Where like the bodies that you buried in your trench are still floating around because you're being flooded and you better be bailing out water. And it's things that we don't think about because we're never taught, oh, these trenches were actually terrifying.
I didn't realize it, being a young, naive kid, that my grandpa was in World War II. As most of, the people in my generation had a family member of War II that were in it. Those guys weren't in a huge hurry to talk about it.
No, no, it's funny because like after listening to that, where it was like you forget that the in World War I, the U.S. soldiers were giants at, let's say 5'9", 140 pounds, because this is before capitalism and grocery stores and everything else, where people had a hard life before refrigeration. Like there's a lot of things that we take for granted, that my great grandmother had one of those like washing machines from the 1920s or 30s, and you look at it and it's like, what is this thing? And we forget how lucky that we are to be in the place that we are right now.
Yeah, when they had old spring boxes and
Yeah.
things like that to keep stuff cool, and how they figured out how to make this hole big enough and this hole small enough that water backed up, but only backed up so much that it didn't flood, but
Yep.
kept all the butter and all of the milk and everything cool like you wanted it to.
Yep. There. It's unbelievable what had to happen to pave the way for where we are now.
Now we went all the way down this rabbit hole, and the whole idea was to talk about coaching and economics. So
Yep.
I don't know. Me and you had gotten to talk about it. So if anybody is still with us and actually still listening to our conversation, you pointed me towards YouTube, the Keynes and Hayek rap battles,
Yep.
which were absolutely phenomenal. I don't know who put them on, but there's the original where it's a debate that turned, I mean, a rap battle is a debate. It's just in a different context than what we expect. And Keynes and Hayek are arguing out their two different ideas. They're arguing out that the government should step in, flood the market with money, keep everything moving, keep everything a top-down approach. Hayek's arguing that by doing less, we can achieve more, let the market steer themselves.
Yep.
That's the basis. So if we take that into the weight room, we're looking at human nature. How do we balance a culture through economics when we look at both of those two models, because they both matter? You can have the King's idea where you're just pumping influence into the weight room from somewhere. You're using rhetoric, you're throwing money at the weight room, you're creating this nice environment, and everybody's going to succeed because we're investing in this and we're going to guide every principle of what you do, as opposed to the Hayek deal where the weight room will weed out the weak and we will build culture off of the strong. Does that make sense? In my head, it probably didn't come out like it is in my head, but does
Yeah.
that make
So
sense?
I would say that Hayek is a little bit less Darwinian, where I think because with Hayek and with Mises or anyone in that Austrian perspective, I would say that it's more because it's voluntary association, first and foremost, that as long as the coach is helping the kids with whatever the kids feel like they need help with, whether it's getting stronger or faster or more explosive, whatever it is, they're going to keep coming back. And the progress, however, the kids value progress, right? So like if there's a kid that isn't into lifting weights and is the worst player on the team, but if they show up and the coach is providing value in the weight room and the kid adds 100 pounds to his squat or takes a tenth off or 2/10 off of his times, or the kid just, because this is one that we didn't even touch on, kids just build confidence if there's a fun environment where everyone can express themselves in a safe manner in the weight room. So if the kids are gaining value through however they determine value, they're going to be more successful. But obviously that's much more of my philosophical bent of let everyone do what they want and the incentives will take care of themselves. So I almost look at, rather than money or currency, progress, however the kids or the coaches value progress, is actually your currency in the weight room. And then on the Keynesian perspective, I think a lot of it kind of depends on where you are, who you get, because like if we look at certain areas of the country, kids tend to be more athletic. So if you're just pumping money into somewhere where kids just have a track record of being more athletic and more successful, wherever that is, that might be a way that just makes, you don't have to have the best coaching. You might not have to have the best facility. But if you keep on pumping in resources into somewhere that's going to be successful regardless, that might be a way that works.
Yes, balancing the commodity. How much effort is put out to how much progress is made. And then that's where kids decide where the economy lies, if it's a good economy or if it's a bad economy.
Yeah, and I think going back to the whole discussion of what is economics, where it's, if you believe that it's subjective, like the Austrian school would, then you kind of leave it there where it's, what, if the kids are having fun, if they're getting stronger, if they're getting faster, if they're actually enjoying what they're doing, and they're in a safe environment where they're actually gaining some kind of values that they and their, obviously the school system or wherever they are, deem valuable, hard work, consistency, all of these things. It's okay to fail. I mean, that might be a huge one that not enough weight is put on that one. But then that's the subjective way of saying, what, you're successful however you want to, evaluate it. Whereas more like a Keynesian model, you might be looking at only progress on this lift or this sprint or whatever it is, and you might be putting too much weight on trying to, like it. I know we've always had to deal with the like jump records, right? So if you're determining your success in a Keynesian perspective based on jump records, and you have a just jump mat and you start cheating it, like you start kicking your feet out and finding ways you might boost progress, but that progress might stall out because you already put in all of these resources into finding ways to fudge the numbers, that you're going to have a bad time in the future because of this artificial pumping of resources that probably shouldn't have been there.
And I think you fall into a private versus public too. Um, the Keynesian model compared to the Hayek seems like on the private side, the Hayek model might be a little easier to navigate because the athletes have to want to show up. And so everything has to revolve around their performance. Not to say that that doesn't happen in the public sector as well, but
Yeah.
at any given time, if they feel like the resource isn't good enough, they're going to quit coming. Where if you're in a public setting, it doesn't matter what the resource says. It doesn't matter where you're at in the markets. You're going to show up and you're going to have to give your money.
Well, and that's where you can actually get into in the public sector too. Like, you're not just talking about Keynes and Hayek. You might be talking about, I actually lump in von Mises as very similar to Hayek because Mises was before Hayek, but you're also looking at Karl Marx with communism, because if you're forcing everyone to be there and everyone's equal and everyone's getting the same training plan, if one person makes more progress than another, you might actually find that it makes you look bad because you put in all of this effort into everyone and only this one is shining, you know, depending on how you perceive progress and success. Like, if you have the star athlete in spite of everything in a losing record in whatever sport you're playing, it you might not want to have that, where if everyone just sucks all the time, hey, it's not your fault. You're trying, you're providing what you can to everyone, and everyone's equal under poverty.
That's I have some notes in here on Marxism and how you see that, especially like on sports teams. It goes from the utopian idea of Marxism and socialism into a Stalin-esque situation very quickly if you're not careful. And then everybody hates being there and nobody's going to put forth any effort because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're all equal.
Well, and especially where it comes, all of these systems in theory, which theory doesn't matter if you can actually put it in practice, but in theory, they all could work. And it just depends on navigating human nature and how to influence personalities. So, like, if you have, you know, ideally everyone's equal under communism, right? But then at the same time, you need to have central planning within communism to make it actually run. Because as we know, like, you put 30 kids in a room, everyone's equal, including the trainer, or the coach, or whoever. If that coach doesn't have the ability to actually implement what they say, nothing's going to happen. You're just going to have chaos. You're going to have anarchy. But if you're able to have that, like, strong dictator, as long as it's a benevolent dictator, it could work. And it's funny because as I have your book right here, and I think that story that you wrote was actually perfect for this, because the coach that takes over, it's almost like Stalin taking over for Lenin, where people perceive Lenin to have been successful in implementing communism, and the propaganda worked really well. You have Trotsky and Stalin, and you have the next generation of a group of dictators that will, it's not just one. And you kind of see how all of the kids under this one tyrannical coach are just miserable. And it takes, and I'd mentioned this in the text, where it's like, oh, that one kid that speaks out and tells the truth is actually like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, where free speech and speaking out and being honest about how oppressed you feel, because, like, kids that aren't making progress in the gym, or they're doing poorly at a sport, and it's just not fun because the coaches pretend to have these high expectations that they're hypocritical, whether it's, they go on vacation but they tell you that you can't, or whatever it is. It just destroys morale. And then you have just this feeling of drowning that a lot of people have felt throughout the years, where it's like when you have that great coach that they don't even have to remind you of what the authority is or what powers that they have, because they're just so pleasant to be around that they're going to casually tell you, hey, if you try this, in your squat, turn your toes out a little bit, or take a really deep breath and really drive through your toes when you're jumping, and you'll hit a PR. You're gonna the kids aren't gonna feel like they're forced to do anything. And going back to like even just my daughter, where she's 5, she's mostly nonverbal. I don't have to tell her to do anything when it comes to like wanting to exercise. It's just fun. It's voluntary association. Where, as you said, with like in the private market, if you're making progress and the kids are feeling like they're doing something successful, they're going to want to come back. So that could be a benevolent dictator in a communistic, setup where, hey, they're forced to, but they don't feel like they're being forced to. It's almost like that Jedi mind trick of, hey, I'm not oppressing you. We're all in it together. We're going to be successful together.
But if they are being forced, they're being forced from a different dictator. They're being forced from their parents in the private setting, because we have no leverage to force a kid to show up. So
Right.
then you throw in a whole different form of economics where, you're almost kind of almost looking at some fascism right there.
Well, and especially with that too, it's almost like trade agreements, right? So like, because you're almost trading with a different country when you're looking at like dealing with parents within, like, if they don't have autonomy and sovereignty over themselves, then you're negotiating with the parents to be able to provide a service for that country. And hopefully they'll understand that trading with your country is going to make a lot more progress and wealth for them. And this goes back to like Jared Bidney or Brandon Bird, where it's like, hey, if I can get your kid a free ride, it's going to save you a lot of money.
Yes. Or yeah, I agree with that. Or I was thinking, it could be similar to a fascism state where the government, the parents are tied in with the businesses, the gym,
Yep.
working together. And if you have to make the parents happy, you have to make the government happy.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what happens. As long as the kids are progressing, none of that matters. It's just the dictator of the parent needs to be happy with the businesses of that to create the Mussolini Italy.
Yeah. And that's where communism and fascism are so similar too, that I kind of lump all of that in together, just because it's almost the same thing, where you, there's one dictator that controls everything, right? So even though there's companies, it's the government isn't taking over the companies to the same extent, and they're allowing them to still use a shred of capitalism to actually be successful. And you kind of see that with like after Mao was the same Deng that took over, and like opening up trade with China, the capitalism inserted into their system is the neo-Marxism, where it's like, oh, okay, well, we're going to use this because it works really well at pulling people out of poverty, but we're going to use this to our advantage.
So when you're looking at that and you're looking at the overall economy of your weight room and you're trying to find out what's working and what's not, and at some point, both are probably working, like you mentioned, to a certain extent to keep it balanced, you're going to have boom and bust cycles.
Yep.
And you're going to have classes of really great athletes and really hard workers. And then you're going to look down the chain and you're going to see athletes that are content with the success that the people before them had. To create the culture you need, what are you looking at there? Are you looking at, hey, let the attrition take care of itself, or should we pump a bunch of resources into this and try to get it turned around and make it better? Will pumping resources into it even work if you're dealing with a mindset of athletes that really don't care?
And I think this is where it goes back to that perspective of is is it subjective or is it not? Like, is the empirical data of if we pump money in, will we see positive effects? Is that true? Or if we just try to be better people as individuals, we'll see progress. So I think that's where a lot of people will get confused because the Austrians are almost nauseating with everything is subjective, and you have to use, it's so focused on individualism of if the parents are happy, if the kids are happy, if the school is happy, then you're good. But with the Keynesian model of we need to pump out progress through those boom and bust cycles, whereas like with the Austrians, it's going to take care of itself as long as everyone's striving to be the best of to their ability. Whereas with a Keynesian kind of approach, you're saying we were really successful back then. Like let's say it's like hypothetically the U.S. economy, you're at the highest level right now, but you're entering a recession. How are we going to pull out of the recession? And if we pump money in, but it's not at the right resources, you're not going to see that success, and you're going to keep pumping money in. And if you're not actually aware of what matters when it comes to creating that success, you might pump in more and more resources. You might get a new athletic director. You might buy new bars and chains and squat racks and force plates and all this stuff. But it might just be that your benevolent dictator is just a jerk, and you need to change your perspective and say, hey, this me and my program isn't working. It's not the infrastructure that we already have. It's the personality issue or something like that.
So now that you say that, it would take me back to LSU. So Orgeron was very open with, hey, all of our eggs are in this basket. We're chasing a national championship. But
Yep.
then we're going to go into a depression for a couple of years until we can use the portal or do whatever it takes to get the athletes in to rebuild it. But this is what you wanted. You wanted a national championship, so this is what I'm going to give you. Well, then what he predicted happened exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So they fired him.
Yep.
And they brought in Brian Kelly, who's had a track record of being successful,
Yep.
but not ever in the SEC. It was more of a northern model, a northern
Yep.
football model with Cincinnati and then with Notre Dame. So he goes to LSU. It's totally unsuccessful. They have to fire him during the middle of the season. Everything collapsed. Where if they just would have listened to Orgeron and managed the boom bust cycle better, they may not have. They spent all the money in the wrong spot is what they did, and they chased the wrong stimulus, and then now they're even further in debt and they're further behind because they didn't look at what the cycle was creating.
Well, and it's interesting because like when you look at strength coaching in general, or just any coaching in general, especially in the university setting, where it's like they do this all the time, where as long as Cal Dietz is successful, he's been at the University of Minnesota for 20 years. Like he's not going anywhere, and he has a track record of success. So it's like nobody's gonna move him anywhere, and even if he did, everyone's gonna be chomping at the bit for him, right? But then you have everyone thinking, it's almost like a fear of missing out, where it's like, oh, so and so is over here. Maybe if we get them, that's gonna change it. But like you might see it with like NFL teams or something like that, where a lot of times it might be the management team. It's not the coach. It's not the athlete. It might just be the atmosphere or the culture of the entire university as a whole. It might be something that you have no control over at all. That you can pour all the resources in that you want, but you know what? If you don't change, and especially with like college age kids too, where you're gonna have some crazy athletes at Miami just because like it's Miami. Like people want to go south, and 18-year-old kids want to go party or whatever. Whereas like North Dakota or Montana, it's like you're not getting that same kid.
No, you're going to have to make do with a kid that fits your environment.
Yeah.
But that's what makes the Keen's idea of economics so difficult, as it pertains to coaching in the weight room, is sometimes you don't know, especially if there's somebody on the outside pulling the strings, you don't know where to plug the money in.
Well, and so that's what's so funny about it, because like as the Austrians will say, the Keynesian model of economics in general is riddled with like contradictions and hypocrisy because of that, where nobody's omnipotent for a while until you figure out what works and what doesn't. You're really just kind of guess and check. So if you have time, like in the private sector, you and I can guess and check and be unsuccessful. And especially with mine, if I'm doing it for free, there's no repercussions because it's just voluntary association. Whereas someone else, like you don't get to guess and check because, like you said, in 3 years, if you didn't turn everything around, you're out.
Now, when you get into, we can go back to the Marxist model a little bit there, but does chasing equal outcomes in sports kind of mirror the flaws of socialism? It's never going to be equal. That's why we compete, and we're trying to create an equal atmosphere that just does not exist.
Now, saying what my bias is, I would argue, yeah, that's true. And then like I would reference was the short story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, where it's like, trying to get everyone to be equal outcome is just kind of silly, where it's like if somebody's too tall, you're going to throw weights up, chains on them to make them slouch, and they're going to get stronger and adapt. So then you add more chains and shackles and try to hold them back. They keep growing stronger and stronger through systematic overload, and just trying to make everyone look the same just doesn't work. Just let people be themselves.
The other one I wonder about is when you get into the Keynesian model, he talks about natural disasters and wars and things like that really spark growth. In athletics, where would the natural disaster come from? Do you see a spark in growth after a coaching change or after a successful season? Where does the growth in a program come from that allows people or has people wanting to invest in the program more?
I'm not sure because a lot of it could be cultural too. Because like in Connecticut, lacrosse in the last 20 years has exploded, and that might be all over the country. But football's less popular, and right now my town shares a football team with two other towns because it's so small. So it's a lot of it is people choosing to live where they want to live and having historically a common interest or developing new interests based on what other people in town are into. So I'm not really sure on that one because everything is so subjective, where what was popular 20 years ago in a different, like I grew up in Southern Connecticut and now I'm in Northern Connecticut. And everyone that I grew up with when I was in high school, we were all at the gym. And yes, it was a Planet Fitness, but originally it was a World's Gym, that Mike Katz Sr. actually owned and operated. But Friday nights, or, you would see everyone lifting. We weren't strong. We were just bro lifting, but everyone was there. Whereas in Somers, Connecticut, that same culture of everyone's lifting weights just doesn't exist because it's more of a soccer and lacrosse town as opposed to a farming community of people that play football because their dad played for the same coach or whatever.
All right, so we can move it a little bit more. And I heard Hayek mention this in the rap battle, and it definitely hit a chord with me because I know in this podcast it's very easily set up to be an echo chamber for what I want to talk about or what I want to hear or a confirmation of my bias. So in strength training, he accused Keynes in economics of just confirming his bias by pumping money in. He saw the result he wanted to see.
Yep.
How often do you think that happens? Is that we surround ourselves with people that agree? We travel down a road and look for the ideas that confirm what we're doing and prove what we're doing is great, as opposed to looking at everything as a whole, bringing in some people that don't agree and looking at more information that might tell us that we're not as good as we think we are. I mean, that could go back before you answer. Sorry. I just thought about this, but this could go back to Boyd Epley and the clean. The data didn't prove that the clean was as successful as what Boyd Epley said the clean was.
Hmm.
So how often are we just confirming a bias?
Oh, constantly. I mean, you look at whether it's if your squat goes up, regardless of like technique, like if your squat goes up, but you're shaving 8 inches off the squat, it's not the same squat. It's a quarter squat as opposed to a full squat. Or, like I explained with the jump numbers where it's like if you're fudging numbers and I was just laughing because I had just started Bob Murphy's book, Contra Krugman, about the contradictions within Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winning economist that's a Keynesian, and just talking about all of the contradictions within there where he says one thing, but he keeps it vague enough to not totally contradict himself. But 5 years later, when he's proven wrong, he says that he's right. And it's like, what? No, that's not how this works. But yeah, I think that we're constantly like with that whole I squatted 600 3 days ago, and it's like, does that confirm my bias? And it's like, well, if my body weight increased and my relative strength didn't go up, or if I didn't create some kind of neural adaptation, or if I'm not training my foot, because I know that that right foot is going to collapse and I don't have the elasticity that the other foot has, depending on what you're actually trying to track and measure, yeah, you're going to fall into confirmation bias of, oh, but he squats 600. And it's like, well, maybe that's not enough. And that always makes me think of, again, Michael Fahey's analogy of the basketball, where it's like, as if you're more elastic, it's like having a filled basketball where it's going to bounce a lot higher with a lot less effort. But if you have a flat basketball because you're not athletic or not elastic, you're going to have to try and smash that basketball a lot harder to try and make it bounce just as high. It'll never bounce just as high, but with enough force, you can try. So what you really have to do is work on trying to inflate that basketball with the elasticity, but adding more force also helps to an extent. It's just which bias do you want to confirm?
Or when do you get outside of your bias and start trying those methods?
Yeah, because especially with that analogy, like just add more force to the basketball, and it's going to keep bouncing, but not as much, and it's going to deflate. Whereas, at what point do you pull out the pump and just fill up the basketball? And I think Michael Fahey got to that point with the when he discovered with his hurdle hops, just sending a kid over to go hop low hurdles really fast over a couple of months, that kid's basketball was actually filling up with air as opposed to just drop it from higher heights with building just a squat or something like that. I think that's why, like, I just reposted the Mike and Brooker, not really a debate, but conversation between Rolf Oman and Will Rattel. But next on my agenda today or tomorrow was actually to go back and re-listen to the Rolf Oman podcast with Michael Fahey, because it was like those guys, especially Rolf, where it's like you can't get enough of him, where there's going to be insights that we all probably overlook that they're acknowledging. And Randy Huntington was the same way with those low level hurdles, where it was like if you're not moving through fast enough, you're actually dampening the effect that you're trying to create.
The one thing I will say about that Rolf Ullman podcast that really made me listen a little harder was I feel like I went through the same progression he did to get, I'm not as good as where he is, but I saw the same
Yep.
things he was doing. Like he was tracking peak velocity and they were trying to match sport.
Yep.
And so they went to a clean and they couldn't
Yep.
get anywhere close to where they wanted to go. And then before too long, they had stripped it down to essentially jumping was the only way you could get the max velocity or the peak velocity high enough to,
Right.
to prepare for the sport you were getting ready to play. So not to say that the clean doesn't play a role up to a certain point. That's a totally different argument. But at some point, you can't go fast enough in training to mimic what you're trying to do in sport unless you
Well,
abandon some principles.
and especially where he had a threshold of like a 10-5 in the 100, and it's like 99% of us will never actually achieve a 10-5. And like especially me, I pulled my hamstring trying to run 16 seconds in the 100 this year at 35, and it's like one of those where it's like, all right, I'm never going to be at that level.
In that little rap battle in the basic of economics, you could get way deeper and read their books and do all that stuff. Well, I obviously didn't take it that far to prepare for this podcast. So they discuss steering markets or setting markets free. How does that apply to coaching styles? How are we able to set the markets free and let them do what they will, as opposed to manipulating the markets to achieve the desired outcome?
So I think that goes back to what you're driving at, or what you value as the market and how you quantify it. Because if you're just letting everyone have fun and developing everyone based on what you believe is going to make them successful, and as long as the kids also find value in whatever you're doing, you're good. And so that would be more of that Austrian perspective of, the free markets. Just do your best at what you believe and see how it goes, kind of thing. Whereas I think with steering markets, you're almost trying to force a goal upon the kids or whoever you're training. Like it doesn't have to be just, it could be on yourself, where it's like, if I cared about my squat, if I only push resources towards that squat, then I better really enjoy just squatting, right? Whereas my perspective on all of these things, whether it's powerlifting, strongman, Highland Games, weightlifting, like, I like making progress, but I need to have fun doing it, because I'm just a general population 35-year-old dad that's just trying to not get out of shape and not die early. So I think you have to kind of make sure that you know what you're steering and why you're steering it the way that you are, and make sure that you're not sacrificing something else because you think that what you're trying to steer as your market, you think matters, but maybe it doesn't. So I think having that, where if you think that adding 100 pounds to your squat, but everyone in the weight room hates squatting, or everyone quits because they get their back hurt, or whatever it is, you just have to be aware of as much as you can, and just be open-minded enough to know that maybe you're wrong, or maybe you're right and you just need to double down on what you're doing. That's also a possibility. But just the awareness of knowing everything. Like, just know everything.
Well, that's what we talked. Well, that's what we talked about pre-show. That the one thing 531 and Jim Windler made abundantly clear was you have to stand for something. So it doesn't matter if you're a Keynesian or you're into the Austrian school. As long as you make a stand and you know which way you're dictating your market, you're going to be successful, because both economists were successful and both ideas work at certain times. But then you don't sway with all these outside sources that are trying to dictate what you should do.
Right. And like, we didn't even get into like monarchies, and I mean, that's more of like a form of dictatorship, which depending on how you want to go, like, you can have a Keynesian model, or even the Hayek type of free markets within a monarchy, where the king determines everything, but you kind of give everyone the autonomy to do what they need to do, how they see fit. So there's a lot more that we could talk about with this, where it's not just one. You could blend kind of a combination of both, like. And this is what's funny about economics too, is you can't go back and like definitively say this, that, or the other, whether you lean towards a Keynesian model, or the Austrian school, or a classical liberal perspective, or we didn't even talk about modern monetary theory, where it's kind of a blend between those two. So you would have like Milton Friedman would be modern monetary theory, where it's like you hear the Austrians, but you think that you can still come up with a model to kind of forecast based on certain assumptions to centrally plan. You're not forcing everyone within the confines of that. So I think having the open-mindedness to have a little bit more nuance within, it could be a combination of everything. And there may be times that you're going to be a Keynesian, or there might be times where you're just going to run the dictatorship, or maybe, if you're like myself, like 35 to 45, and you're just looking for a training crew, maybe it is communism, and maybe there is no, you guys all just meet up and you decide, hey, we're gonna do this together. It's all gonna be this way. We're gonna, maybe it's not as loose as the, Mises or Hayek, where it's voluntary association. Maybe you're obligated. Hey, I mean, this would be almost like the like a typical old school powerlifting crew, where it's like, if you're not, you know, if you're not going to every training session, you might get kicked out of the group. And I think that would be almost more of like a utopian Marxist approach, where it's like, this is your duty and your obligation to show up and be here at this day and at this time, and there's no excuses. Do not, or you're going to be I mean, that's almost West Side, right? Where it's like you're going to be asked to leave if you're not showing up. Whereas more of the Hayek or Mises might be more like a Dave Tate, like after leaving West Side, where it's like, hey, we're not going to have these rules. We're going to have a little bit more flexibility because we're old, we're washed up, and we're not dealing with Louis anymore.
So is the weight room a means to an end, or is the weight room the end itself? Is it just the means to make sport better, or is the weight room what dictates sport outcomes?
I would say that it's a means where, again, everything is so subjective, so everyone's going to decide what they think moves the needle. And for some people, we all know of the stories of the guys that don't train right at all, and they're just freak athletes and they make incredible progress. And then you have others that they would have been bench warmers, or they would have quit 1 year in if it weren't for the weight room. So I think it all just depends on what you believe, and just whatever you value. As long as you have a reason for it and you believe in that, it doesn't really matter.
So this is one I was kind of wondering on as I sit back and watch, especially probably maybe at the high school level, because of the politics involved in the difficulty in certain areas getting coaches, the difficulty of getting athletes. Like you said, football is whether we want to admit it or not, in a lot of the country, football is dying.
Yep.
Missouri was a very strong 11-man state for a long time. Now you can look at it and it's an 8-man state.
Mm-hmm.
But in saying that, are we spending more time bailing out failing programs instead of letting the course of Hayek take care of itself, and getting rid of people that are involved in failing programs?
I would say so. I mean, again, because nothing is actually a perfect voluntary association, and everything's associated with, whether it's public schools or private schools, there's always funding for all of these programs, and the program wants to exist. Whether they're successful or not doesn't really matter. So the program, in the perspective of anyone associated with the program or with the school with the funding, is going to say, hey, we need to put more emphasis on this so that we can turn it around and change the culture of, let's say, the town or whatever. And so they might double down. It's the sunk cost fallacy, where we're failing, but if we throw more money at it, we're gonna, hopefully, maybe we won't fail as quickly. Whereas if you just kind of let everything be, who's to say? But I think the problem, just arguing with myself right here, where it's like, if you say just let it be, I mean, if you leave it up to kids or leave it up to parents, a lot of people will just do nothing and nobody will do anything. And then you just lost all of the culture that you might have had within that town.
That's interesting, because as I look at a few towns around us, I've seen where they've had to bring in athletic directors from outside the community to take care of the business that the community would not. So in saying that, there was a Hall of Fame coach not too far away who was holding up the school from going 8-man. He really believed they were an 11-man school. They were not successful at 11-man. They were struggling getting the kids out, and he was holding on to an idea that it's going to get better. Just wait, it's going to get better. Well, it does not look like it's going to get better. So they had to bring in somebody to remove him, which was not probably a great job to have. You got to remove a Hall of Fame coach. But in order to progress into the future, 8-man is where they were heading. They had to make some really hard decisions. So I just wonder, for years they just kind of threw some money at it or threw some resources at it trying to get this to work. But at a certain point you have to say, okay, enough's enough. We have to cut our losses and move on. So you can Keynes it for so long, but eventually you have to Hayek it.
Well, and especially just look at like Kodak, right? So like they created this amazing innovation that bankrupted themselves, where sometimes the technology that you create upends what you thought you were all about. You see it in coaching where somebody that used to have their entire personality was this one thing, but then they look at something else from a different perspective and it changes their outlook. And I think with that, you might go with like a Hank Kreinoff. I mean, he's probably one of the most interesting figures in sprinting because he's done everything for so long. And so watching, and he has, almost no following on Instagram, but I just sent a post from him from like 4 years ago about vibration plates. And I was talking to Sammy Seabach and Michael Fahey, a couple months ago about the vibration plates. And it's like Hank Kreinoff was doing this 20 years ago. And so it's like sometimes you watch and you see what people are doing, and it's like so much of what we know, we don't even know what we don't know, and we don't know where we're going in the future. So to be part of a small group of guys that were like, I wonder if vibration plates will work for elasticity as opposed to like neurology and rate coding and all of this other stuff, and seeing, oh, this is where people went before. And then it's like, as you're standing on the shoulders of giants, it's like, oh, this isn't what they did before, but this is why. And you kind of see where things go once something's out of the market, but you see how innovative they were. And you can go down the rabbit hole of like Nikola Tesla with stuff like that, where it's like he was so far ahead. And then it's like you look at the like wireless charging today, and it's like there's an 80-year gap between Nikola Tesla and wireless charging. But here we have it today and we don't think anything of it. But if we go back to ourselves 20 years ago and it's like, you can charge something wirelessly, this is, we're living, the most incredible thing in the world.
Don't get me down the Tesla rabbit hole. We don't have enough time, but that whole.
But just seeing how like sometimes technology pushes forward, and then when you take a step back, it's like, oh well, it's been right in front of our face this whole time.
Right, it just wasn't utilized because it wasn't as necessary. You had a forward thinker that could see the possibilities of it, but then you had the rest of the population that was like, we don't need that. That's where everything's been: the email, internet, AI.
Yeah, or things are strategically become worn out. I mean, you see that in like the car industry where like, or tractors, especially like if you look at old tractors where it's like everything from 1940 to 1958 or 1960. I'd even go as far as like 1980. They're still running. They still exist. Whereas like as soon as you got into the hydraulic transmissions and computers in the 90s and 2000s, transmissions blow and the computer associated with the tractor doesn't work, and there's nothing on the market, or they're valued at because value is subjective, where in that retail market you see the price of things where a 1950s this or that, like an 8N or a 9N is worth the same as a early 2000s Kubota or John Deere, because the 2000s isn't going to last. and the amount of parts and the cost of parts to repair it is much more for the same value that you're getting out of it for a hobbyist farm of less than, let's say, 50 acres. So everything is very subjective, and you don't know with the way that things work, you don't know what is worth investing in, and sometimes you make the wrong decision. And like going back to the gym, like I had a push band for velocity tracking in 2018, and then Whoop or whoever it was bought them out, and now it's useless. Or I bought the gravity box, and actually, I like to brag that I had mentioned it to Fahey, and then that was the catalyst, at least in my mind. Me being weird and finding gravity box is what led Fahey to meeting Adam and creating OVR. And it's just these weird things where it's like I still use my gravity box, but the app isn't supported. I need to get the OVR for the time to peak velocity and the EAI index, but a lot of technology becomes obsolete. It doesn't mean that at the time it wasn't a good value, because $250 Canadian for a velocity tractor is still unheard of. As technology improves, older models become obsolete.
Now, before I run out of space on this computer, we've been going a while. In both models, it will show up, and then I think it falls back to how you handle that. But how do we help the unemployed in sports? The non-players or the injured athletes, kids that just want to be a part of the weight room, but they're not in a sport.
So
Yeah, go ahead and elaborate on that.
I was going to say, because my entire gym is voluntary association, I think just creating an environment that is fun and kids want to be a part of it. Like I've never asked anyone to show up here, where if you're having fun, you're doing things that interest other people, it'll take care of themselves. Especially like that one kid, Christo, the Albanian kid, he was into Dungeons and Dragons. He didn't play any sports. He had no sporting background, but he's a whiz kid when it comes to memorizing stats, and he's obsessed with soccer and football and all of these other things. And just being in the weight room in my basement was a catalyst for him to strike up a conversation with his old friend Pat, who now trains here too. Where if it wasn't for the weight room, the kid that played Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't be friends with, or wouldn't be as close of friends with, his former extremely athletic friend that was also really into the weight room. So it's kind of like a bridge where as long as it's an environment where people want to be, people will be there.
See, and I think that leans more to those athletes fall more into the Keynesian model as opposed to the Hayek, but I could be wrong. Just because you throw some resources at that to make it available to extra athletes, you give them a place to go. Where the Hayek model, there may not be enough room, enough funds, enough time to bring those on, and they would fall off just because the resources weren't there for them.
Well, you could take it the other way, that the Hayek model could be also self-funded, where there's an abundance, where there's too many resources. Like in my own gym, I had too many resources where I need more people to come, and it's where you have enough resources where you can afford to just choose to give. Like, this is the whole nuance of people don't understand that, like with taxation, right? You don't need to force the government to do something if you just choose to like do it yourself. So charity is an example of that. Like, you don't need to force people to help the homeless if you just choose to help the homeless. And that's where, soup kitchens or churches and all of these other organizations, where it's people that are willingly choosing to help other people. They're not obligated. They're not stealing from their neighbor to feed this person down the street. It's, I'm choosing to associate with this. So I think you could take that from the other perspective of, if the weight room is successful, and it doesn't need to have more resources thrown at it because it is so successful on its own, where kids are bringing in things, or like in my own this iPad that I'm using to talk on, Christo and Pat actually gave to me at Christmas as a gift, and I didn't obligate them to do anything. It was just voluntary association, and new resources are being created based on the value that they perceive, as opposed to me charging them a monthly fee and then using that to stimulate and grow the gym.
I can see that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but we deal with the same thing here. Kids look around, they see what the next piece of equipment they want is. They pull together, we formulate a plan, and
Yeah,
that's how we end up with things. So I could see how that could go both ways. And the whole idea of all of this was, I think, as you watch sports programs, you see success, you see the booms, but then you see programs start to go into recessions. Sometimes they come out, sometimes they go into a depression.
right.
So the idea of understanding economics enough to predict where your program is going, I think is important. And I've never been able to really, and I still don't know how well I got my thoughts across, but I've never really been able to dig into it as deep as I wanted until today.
And especially with that too, when you look at human nature, and this is where you get into more of like the Ludwig von Mises, where if you're trying to use reason to understand what has happened in the past, you're not trying to centrally plan to try and dig your way out of it. You're just looking at, why did this happen in the past, and okay, what common sense things can I do to address this in the future, as opposed to more of that Keynesian model of, here's what we did, we're going to essentially plan how to get ourselves out of it, because a lot of times you don't know that. And that's where, I mean, that rabbit hole of, and this is where the conversations like this are great, because there's so many of these subtle nuances between the different thought processes between the Keynesian model and an Austrian perspective. And that's why the Austrians are very fringe, because they are so devout and stubborn when it comes to freedom and economic choice and liberty and voluntary association, where they might have something that somebody else has never even considered as a possible implication for why they do what they do.
Well, man, we could go on with this for a while, but like I said, I actually am worried about my memory a little bit on all this. So I want to make sure I get it stored and put up. So
Yep.
thank you very much for spending your whole Sunday morning talking economics in the weight room with me.
Thank you.
I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.